Hi, friends. Welcome. In this episode of Insights at the Edge, my guest is Frederic Laloux. Frederic Laloux is someone I consider to be an inspired visionary, which is not a term I use often or lightly. An inspired visionary who applies his creative mind to helping us remake our world. In his own words, he tries to square not always easily the many projects he's passionate about with his inner knowing that he's meant to live a simple life, spending much time with his family and, whenever possible, in the silent presence of trees. Frederic is a celebrated business thinker and social entrepreneur, and this year marks the 10-year anniversary of his seminal book, which was self-published, called Reinventing Organizations, a book which has sold now, after 10 years, more than 1 million copies and is now translated in more than 20 languages. Frederic's current focus is on something he calls the week, and we're going to learn more about this. It's a powerful new approach to inspire mass mobilization to confront environmental breakdown and the climate crisis. Frederic, welcome to Insights at the Edge.
I'm so excited to be with you again.
You have a willingness to go deep into areas that cause and are the sources of so much human pain. You say that part of the reason that you think Reinventing Organizations resonated so well with so many people over the last 10 years. You write about this in the new foreword to the 10th anniversary edition, is because the workplace is a source of so much pain in so many people's lives. And now here, you're addressing at this current time the climate crisis that we're in. And also an area that is so painful for many of us. Sounds True is located in Colorado. There are 4 fires right now burning from extreme heat within a 45-minute drive of our offices. And I wanted to start our conversation by understanding the lens you use internally to tackle systemic change and systemic problems. I think a lot of us are like, that's beyond me. I don't know. I'm going to do my part. But you actually go into it and look at it at a systemic level and how we can be change makers at that level. Tell me about that process for you.
Yeah, I mean, at some level, that's just who I am in my makeup. Like whenever I see a problem, I feel like, I'd love to help this one person, but like, how could we help as many? Like, there's just so much suffering in the world. So I tend to be drawn to these systemic questions. But I've also been, obviously influenced by many people, and one of the persons that's influenced me is Ken Wilber, whom who lives in close to Boulder, and yeah, he has, I think, a particularly potent lens to look at these systemic questions, because we tend to oppose either systemic questions that feel like these big cold systems that we're trying to influence, or there is the human, the relational world, the inner world, the spiritual world, right? And that feels like, okay, that's my small world of my own inner work and inner development, but how do I square these things? And for readers for people who are interested in how to square those, the most potent lens I found is Wilber's work. And we might not go into the details, but like the 4 quadrants, that every problem that's arising in this world, you can look at it from 4 angles, right? And one of them is the systemic angle. One of them is the inner angle, the mindsets and beliefs that we bring to any problem. Another is the behavioral things that we do. Another is the cultural thing. And unless we tackle things from all 4 perspectives, we're probably going to fall short. So anybody who says, oh, the solution to all our systemic problems is just if we raise individual consciousness, then everything will be fine. that is definitely a part of it, but it's just one part of it, right? Other people just look, let's just change the system, let's change the policy, let's change the incentive systems, let's change, politics. It's Washington that can change. Well, that's one angle, but it's only one angle. If we don't, bring this with a cultural transformation and inner transformation, it's not going to last. And so that's how I tend to look at problems, is we need to look at it from all four angles. And that's what I've tried to do with both Reinventing Organizations, the organizational work, and now the climate work.
Originally, with Reinventing Organizations, you referred to the organizations that are moving to this next level of human consciousness as Teal organizations. Can you explain that for people who are new to integral theory, what that means to be a Teal organization?
So Teal comes from this color scheme that was, again, coined by Ken Wilber. And Ken Wilber, like many others, have looked at the fact that for some reason, it looks like human evolution doesn't happen sort of linearly, but that we make these big societal leaps, right? We go from hunter-gatherer societies where we have like small communities of 20 to 40 people to like small chiefdoms. And that was a big leap. And then we stayed there for a while. And then we made the leap to agrarian societies, and then we made a leap to industrial societies with the industrial and scientific revolution. That was a leap, and then we made a leap to sort of the knowledge era that we're in now, postmodernism. And each of these stages comes with its own outlook, with its own worldview, with its own value system, with its own technologies, with its own governance systems. And Wilber gives these colors stages, right? So the agrarian stage is amber, the scientific industrial stage is orange, the postmodern stage is green. And the stage of consciousness that is emerging right now, he gives the color teal, and that's the color I've used. And what I've done in Reinventing Organization is use this lens to look at organizations and management, right? Because each of these stages comes with a distinct way to think about how we should structure and run organizations. Should we structure organizations like armies? Is a good organization like a good army? Or is a good organization like a good machine? Or is a good organization like a family? Or, so there's these distinct ways of looking at management. And I've been most interested in this next stage that's emerging. So for all those people who feel something in the way we manage organizations today doesn't feel right, doesn't help humans in it to flourish. There's so much more in people than what our current systems allow. Couldn't we structure and run our organizations differently? I looked at a number of people, quite extraordinary pioneers, who had that impression and decided, okay, I'm not going to run my organization in the way that business schools tell us we should do it. I'm not going to run it in the way that traditional consulting firms tell us to do it. I just want to run it in a different way that allows humans to flourish. And what was so fascinating in this research I did was that I identified a number of founders of these organizations. And even though they were often thinking that they were the only crazy fools that really dared to push the envelope and try out, many new things, what they ended up with, even though they didn't know of each other, was often remarkably similar, as if there's something, that's ready to be downloaded, as if sort of the next stage of how, of consciousness also comes with the next stage of how we, should think about organizations and collaboration.
Now, to understand more, Frederic, because I think you have a way of making integral theory understandable and applicable, and I really have a great respect for it. It's one thing for an individual to go from, oh, this level of consciousness, and something happens in their life, and now they're at another level. But for whole systems to move, for us to move as a society, how do you see that working for us to become, have a teal worldview, not just in business, but in lots of other of the collective systems by which we organize ourselves?
Others have looked at it more deeply than I have about sort of these societal leaps, but what you see generally is that some people are precursors. Typically, artists tend to be precursors, right? They sense this new worldview, they put it in their art, and it's small scale. It's the art that they do, right? And often organizations are sort of the next things to follow because it's just a small group of people, right? You have 10, 20, 30, 50 people, employees, or that organize in a different way. And that's still relatively doable. You just need one or two leaders who really have that hope, that dream, that vision. And they hold a space that's strong enough for this little bubble of the next consciousness to manifest, in this world. And then you start to have larger, economic systems, and finally the political system, tends to be one of the last to shift, and we're obviously not there yet. So we're just at the stage where we see lots of smaller organizations, like since the book came out, I know that there's a few thousand organizations that have adopted these things. There's lots of these little bubbles and experiments. We see some larger organizations that are starting to shift there. And I don't have a crystal ball. I think, for our political and economical systems to, transition, maybe hopefully it will be in 10, 20 years. Maybe it might take 30, 40, 50 years. We will see.
Okay, here's actually the question that's the deepest in my heart that I want to ask you, Frederic, which is, I listened to a conversation that you had with Thomas Hubel, and he was asking you about your view of systems change at this time. And you said something to the effect of this being a great adventure, and that many people experience this time as a time of dread. That's my word, or, a period of gloom, the poly crisis that we're in. How do you maintain this perspective of being a great adventurer?
I mean, when you look at history, right? There are these moments of confusion and possibility, right? I mean, for thousands of years, we had feudal systems where it was obvious that we would be ruled by a king, generally a man, and when the king dies, his eldest son will take over, as intelligent or stupid as that person is. And that was just the way it was. I mean, nobody was thinking that something else was possible. And then suddenly this idea of democracy shows up. And within just a few decades in the Western world, this idea took on. But that was a period of incredible confusion and dread and, French Revolution, violence. But from that emerged just a whole different way for us to think about society, think about, women's rights. I mean, I'm reading a book to my 11-year-old daughter now in the 19th century about a clever 14-year-old girl who's interested in fossils and, history and society. And she can never ask a question in polite society because as a girl, she has to appear silly and decorative and stupid. And just the pain of reading that to my daughter and going like, should I even read this? Should my daughter even integrate that a girl has to act that way? And this is 150 years ago. So those times were confusing, just as our times are now. But the possibility of reinvention that we have now is incredible. Like, I often think we're in this race of destruction versus consciousness. And we have no idea how this thing is going to end. Anybody who says it's gloom, it's too late for climate, I go like, how do you know? And anybody who's sort of like this, spiritual optimist and does spiritual bypassing and says like, oh, everything will be okay because, hasn't looked at the science of it, right? And in the midst of that, like, if there's any time I could choose to be alive, like this for me is the moment I can have, like, this is just the most extraordinary playing field. Like, we are about to, let me give you another metaphor I sometimes play with. I feel like every single system we work with is rotting and in need of reinvention. It's as if we're walking on a wooden floor and every one of these planks is rotting. I mean, our education system obviously isn't working anymore, right? We get a chance to fundamentally reinvent our education system, right? Imagine an education system that's infused with everything that you're doing. It sounds true, right? In many ways, we know how to do it. We just haven't applied it at scale yet. The education system needs to be reinvented. The agricultural system, right? Our industrial agriculture, our factory farming is killing the planet, is no longer working, is depleting the soils. We need to reinvent it. And there's thousands of people who are doing amazing things in regenerative agriculture. Go in these circles and you'll be incredibly hopeful, right? We need to reinvent our political systems. Obviously, democracy as we practice it now is exhausted. And there's people working at the forefront of systems of sortition and participative democracy that are fascinating, right? And hopefully within 30, 40 years, we'll have cracked that, right? We have to reinvent our finance systems. We have to reinvent our justice systems. We have to reinvent our production systems. The consumption, the way we consume, doesn't make anybody happy and destroys the planet, right? And there's people who are venturing into ways to work in a circular economy that makes everybody way more happy. In each of these fields, there's thousands of people who are actively working on this, who are prototyping, who are experimenting, who are bringing things to scale. If you plug into any of these groups, you can't but be energized, because it's just amazing what's happening. So we're at the stage where it feels confusing. And maybe in 10 years, we'll be at a stage where we see all of these things starting to click. And I don't know, I don't have a crystal ball, but what an amazing time to be alive, because that's just the adventure that's given to us.
10 years after publishing Reinventing Organizations, part of the journey was that you created, several years after the book came out, a 130 session video series on insights for the journey for people who are in traditional businesses who are interested in making the kinds of shifts that you describe in Reinventing Organizations. And I wonder if you can share what you've discovered through all the talks you've given, the questions you've been asked, are some of the biggest misconceptions that people were left with when they read Reinventing Organizations. Like, Frederic said XYZ, and I thought he meant this other thing. Wait a second, because that's part of what you do in this video series, is offer these corrections.
Yeah. I mean, to start with, one correction that feels important to me is, so I talked about these Teal organizations, right? That's just a description. But some people have come to see this as a concept that was worthwhile on its own, and they want to become a Teal organization. And whenever people tell me, I want to become a Teal organization, I go like, why? Like, what's your deeper longing? What's your deeper, right? And so people aspire to become a concept, and like, nobody wants to be a concept. And what I noticed is people who do this transition and who, throw out to all their colleagues, we will become a Teal organization or a self-managed organization, tend to get a lot of resistance, because it's a concept and people go like, what is a Teal organization? And this sounds weird, and self-management, does that even work? And, get a lot of resistance. Whereas when leaders speak from the heart and talk about what is it that really drives them, what is it in this book that has resonated with them so much, and make an invitation based on that, they get everybody to follow. I'll share an example that I share in one of the videos that really brought this home for me. I was talking with the CEO of a university hospital, big hospital, thousands of nurses, and she wanted to introduce self-management to the nurses. And she had, thrown out the concept, we're going to go towards self-management, and she got enormous pushback. I mean, this is a hospital, self-management, are you kidding me? Like, these life and death decisions, we can't just let people do whatever they want. And so I asked her, I said, why is this? You're passionate. I see you're passionate about it. Why? And for a long time, she threw out sort of buzzwords like, I want them to be empowered. I want them to be motivated. I want them, sure, but why you? Like, what is it in you, right? And at some point, she got almost angry at me for pushing her, because I was like, I still don't feel it, right? And at some point, she was almost angry. She said, Frederic, I tell you why. 6 months ago, I was at one end of the hospital and I had a meeting outside, and I had to go towards these endless corridors of this university hospital, right? And it was 3:45 in the afternoon. And everywhere along that corridor, there were nurses at 3:45 waiting for it to be 4 o'clock so that they could clock out. And I was disgusted by my own organization that had taken these talented, amazing people who chose the nursing profession not to get rich, but to serve people. And our organization, the way we treat them, has turned them into people who just can't wait to leave. When she told me that story, I had shivers. I was like, okay, I got it. If you talk about it this way, if you make this invitation, don't talk about self-management, don't talk about Teal organization, but say like, we can't continue treating nurses the way we treat them, where we don't trust them with anything, even though they're these incredibly accomplished individuals. And I want to find a way where these people can determine for themselves how they best serve their patients. Everybody follows you, right? So that's, one insight that I got from talking with lots of people is don't talk about a concept, first determine what's in you makes you want to do this, is one example of one of these learnings and misconceptions.
Right, good. It's important, Frederic. And I think for people who are hearing about reinventing organizations and Teal organizations and aren't familiar with the framework, you mentioned self-management, and that's one of the three kind of cornerstone ideas that you have that characterize these Teal organizations. Another is wholeness, that people feel like they can be themselves, their whole selves at work. And in that section, you actually even profile good old sounds true.
Yes,
and,
from 10 years ago.
Yep. And we're not going to spend a lot of time on wholeness. I think that's something that our sounds true audience and listeners to Insights at the Edge are pretty familiar with. And then the third characterization is this one of evolutionary purpose.
Yeah.
I want to circle back to self-management, and then we'll talk some about evolutionary purpose, because I think that's the one that probably is the most triggering for people who are in business frameworks that were built on a different level of human development, on a kind of command and control army style. What do you mean? There's no general? And I think you've tried to clarify. People are just like, what does that mean? Does the C-suite get destroyed? Like, what's happening?
Yeah, absolutely. And to be honest, like when I started this research, I wasn't expecting to find self-management wasn't on my radar screen. I was, schooled in, the good old traditional hierarchy and pyramid. And I stumbled upon these extraordinary organizations, some of which had been around for decades, very successful, and sometimes very, difficult environments, going through recessions and with, forms of self-management. And it's true that as soon as I talk about self-management, I wish there was a better word, people immediately have these conception of self-management means no more hierarchy, no more structures. Anybody can do whatever they want. Often they have this, sort of 1960s counterculture image of, we're all going to sit in a circle and we're going to talk till the end of the night, or we're going to talk for days until we reach consensus, and obviously people dread that, right? Because a lot of people have tried that and that doesn't work, right? That is horrible. When that sort of thing happens, when there's no structure and, no one knows how to make a decision and we wait for consensus, it becomes so painful that people then just beg, like, somebody make a decision, bring hierarchy back, because this is just too painful, right? And so that's a typical misconception. There's no more structure, there's no more, decisions from the top, everybody's equal. We won't have the time to really go into the details, but what self-management means is that instead of having these strict formal hierarchies that you used to have in a pyramid, right? Where my box is the boss of your box, right? So I'm your boss, Tami, and which means I get to make all the decisions. I get to decide if you're hired, fired, if you get a nice project, if you get a raise. And on every single question, I have more to say than you, right? That's sort of the traditional hierarchy. What you do with self-management is that you create fluid hierarchies, meaning you still have hierarchies, but you have hierarchies of skill, of passion, of expertise. And we create structures that make that on this topic, Tami, you know so much more than I do. So obviously you'll take the lead and I will follow. On this other topic, I have more expertise or more passion and I will take the lead and you will follow, right? And so, we have these mechanisms, but there's still clear structures, accountability. We still know who's responsible for what. We still know if something isn't working, who should I look for? And the easiest way to explain that for people and to demystify it is to say, okay, imagine, Tami, you and I are part of a team, right? We're in an organization, we're part of a team of 8 people, okay? And I used to be the boss. I used to be the team leader, right? And imagine we're switching to these forms of self-management. What we would typically do is we would spend an afternoon, let's say 4 hours, in a session where we list what are all the tasks of the manager, right? What were all of my tasks, right? And we start listing them. And typically you end up with 10, 12, 15, right? The task is to hire people. My task is to onboard people. My task is to make sure people are happy. My task is to do performance management of the people. My task is to set a vision. My task is to represent our group to the outside world, right? My task is to do conflict management if there's, right? So we start listing these things. And then we say, instead of all of these tasks being with me, and to be honest, like I might be good at some of them, but probably there's some that I don't do at all because I don't like them. Maybe, I'm really bad at conflict management and I don't do it at all. And I let conflict fester and it makes everybody's life miserable simply because, that's not what I like to do. So instead of giving me all of these things, let's just spread them out. Okay, who wants to deal with conflict if there's conflict? Who wants, to be the outside face of our group to the outside world? Who will be responsible for performance management to check if our numbers add up, right? Who will do the onboarding? And then we'll just distribute these roles. There's still very clear accountability. People now know, Tami, that you're responsible for performance management. If the numbers are bad, the other people in the organization will look to you. If there's conflict and I don't deal with it, people will look to me. And in that way, we distribute these responsibilities. And it's not rocket science. Like once you start doing it, people go like, duh. And it tends to work much better because people pick and choose the parts that they're good at, that they like, or that they want to learn. And suddenly we all feel responsible. Before, I was the only one really feeling responsible, and I had to sort of use carrot and sticks to get you guys to, do stuff. But now suddenly we're this team that shares this responsibility. So when you think about it, it's not rocket science. And generally, when you apply it, it tends to work much better than sort of traditional forms of management.
Right. Well, there's a lot of nuance here, and you made a 130-part video teaching series to answer a lot of the questions that come up in Reinventing Organizations, because there's a lot there. And even as you're describing, well, like who's best at this and who wants to do this, what I see in the room happening potentially is conflict. Like 4 people all want to do this one thing. Well, who wants to do it? They say friendly, and who decides?
Yeah. And there's different methods to do it, right? So yeah, we won't go into the details, but there's something called the advice process, right? And we can just decide in this group, okay, like let me imagine I was the former manager, right? I still retain that decision power of of the 4 I choose, right? Or there's something called candidateless election, which is a very elegant, simple process where now, okay, for this particular task, right, there's these 4 people and we do a round of elections and we just see who everybody thinks is the best person to do this. Or we do a rotating form where we do, after every year, we rotate this thing. So there's just lots of mechanisms that people come up with to deal with these kind of questions.
Some people will say, if you want to see a really well-run organization, look to see who the leaders are, the quality of the leaders. The quality of the leaders really matter. What do you say to that in the midst of looking at self-management, like this notion that there doesn't need to be that kind of high-quality leader?
I absolutely believe that's essential. So that's another misunderstanding is, right, we no longer need leaders. Right? What you see in these self-managing organizations is that they tend to be very leader-full organization. What you want is as much leadership as possible. We don't want to suppress any leader, right? And so what you absolutely need is a few strong leaders who hold that vision, because this is still very countercultural, right? And so we've seen a lot of organizations that worked really well in self-managing fashion. And then the 1 or 2 or 3 leaders who really cared for this, and in the lingo that I use, hold the space for self-management, leave, and traditional managers take over. And they go like, okay, I don't understand how this works. Let's get a good old pyramid. And then the whole thing sort of loses its mojo. So you absolutely need some people who understand this, want this, and hold the space so that other people can step up. I've seen this, for example, in factories, traditional factories that move over to this system. It's often very, very moving stories because you had people who were working on the factory floor, who had often little formal education or were even broken by the school system, had little self-confidence, were at the bottom of the pyramid, weren't trusted to make any decisions. And suddenly we create spaces where they can show up. And often these people, at home are brilliant people, right? At home, they fix all sorts of machines, they do all sorts of things, right? And in the workplace, show up as a small version. Suddenly they bring all of these things into the workplace and they become like these much bigger versions of themselves. But it takes time. It's sometimes a painful process for these people to break out of this old shell and trust the system and grow. And so we need leaders on top of that that can create a space for other people to blossom. The image that I sometimes use is, often people think self-management means we want everybody to have the same power, right? We don't want any strong leaders, right? Because that would be antithetical. And the image that I use is, no, we want the strongest, most beautiful ecosystem that we can have. In a forest, you have tall trees and you have beautiful ferns and you have small mushrooms. The goal is not for the mushroom to grow as tall as the tree, right? The goal is for the mushroom to be the biggest, most beautiful mushroom it can be, for the fern to be the most beautiful fern, and for the tree. And so we absolutely need big trees, just like we need, big, beautiful ferns and big, beautiful mushrooms. So the idea that, in these organizations, leaders are no longer needed. No, you lead it even more, but in a whole different way. And I talk about it in a video where you create space rather than making tons of decisions yourself. You create space for other people to, grow and make these decisions.
This could get a little abstract, Frederic, but I think you can help me keep it grounded, which is when you were talking about integral theory and how we can grow to new levels of development. You mentioned the time that we're in collectively right now as being this postmodern time. Some people call it the green level, where everyone's perspective matters and we're not that interested in hierarchy. And then we're moving to Teal. So help me understand how, quote unquote, self-management can be distinguished and is actually this next level of consciousness coming into being.
Yeah. So we live in these interesting times where a number of these worldviews exist at the same time, right? We have sort of the red worldview, that is embodied by Trump right now, which is that only power counts, right? And who is more powerful, who's less powerful, that's the only thing that counts, right? We have, what Wilber calls the amber worldview. So there's this traditional worldview, like, the world is a God-given thing with absolute immutable laws that God has given us, and you're on the right side of God's law and the wrong side of God's law, right? And that's one worldview. The one that's maybe most dominant today is, sort of the scientific industrial worldview, right? The world is this complex mechanic, and we'll investigate it, and the better you investigate it, the more money you can make. That's sort of like the worldview that is dominant in business schools and in Wall Street, right? That's in science and academia, right? That's sort of like the dominant worldview there. And then all of these worldviews accept hierarchy as a given, right? And then the next worldview, which you alluded to, is green or postmodern, right? Which is starting to become dominant in academia, is this worldview that's very uncomfortable with hierarchies, right? And for good reasons, because hierarchies have for a long time been hierarchies of oppression, right? And so these hierarchies have hurt tremendous numbers of people, and these hierarchies socially have put men on top of women, have put white people on top of people of color, and have put cisgender people and have put heteronormative. Yeah. So we have all of these systems that were baked into these hierarchies, and so postmodernism wants to do away with all of that, right? And I imagine that in the circles of people who are listening to, a lot of people feel like that, right? A lot of us feel like that for good reasons, and we're like, we don't like any of this hierarchy because that hierarchy was just came with a lot of oppression. And so we go to the other extreme, which is this sort of absolute relativism, which is like, actually, no truth is bigger than any other truth. Everything just depends on your perspective, right? And it tends to go with identity politics. Tami, you being a woman and I being a man, and, we can never fully understand that your truth is as valid as mine. And that has a powerful role to play in breaking down these old hierarchies that, have lived their day. But when we take it too far, suddenly we're only these atomized people, or at best, as atomized groups of people. And Tami, you're a woman, I'm a man. We can never fully understand each other, right? Or, we're black, you're white, we can never fully. And there's never any truth that we can find, right? And where Teal's goes to is to say, to reestablish the notion that not everything is relative. There is ways for us to discern truth, but it doesn't need to come in the old way with these fixed hierarchies, right? And that's where all of these fluid hierarchies come into play, where we, unlike Green, don't want to abolish hierarchy. We just want to make sure that the most potent person, has the most power on the things that matter. And, if I know about fixing a machine, I should make that decision. If you know about marketing, you should make that decision, right? And so that's, where we're trying to get at. And so it's sort of Wilber talks about it as actualization hierarchies rather than domination hierarchies or growth hierarchies, hierarchies that allow us to grow to the fullest version of ourselves, rather than hierarchies of oppression that try to keep certain people from becoming, their best versions.
It's helpful. One of the things I'm flashing on is how in any given job title, the title can become kind of the trophy or the thing, but that's not really the point. If you just take the title away and you look at all the strands that somebody does, all the different work pieces, then you can get a much more actualized description of their true talents.
And you get amazing things that happen. I see this over and over again in those organizations who make this leap, where suddenly, instead of thinking like this box with this job description that we used to have, but now we have all these strands, as you call them, or these roles, whatever we want to name this. And I can be on the shop floor, right? And my roles include, maintaining certain machines, but maybe at home, I do amazing video editing. I've seen a person like this, right? I'm just passionate. I'm great. I also, as one of my roles, I actually spend a few hours, doing editing for the marketing team, right? And that was unthinkable before because you were on the factory floor, you had that job description, but now I can do this because I have this amazing skill that I can bring. And so we can start to create sort of like these portfolios where people grow into things. And it also allows us, hey, you're going on vacation. Let me just take on your 3 roles for 2 weeks because I want to learn them. And it makes, all of these things possible. I want to grow in this area. Let me just try on this role. Let me try on this role of conflict resolution, because actually for me, it's a growing edge, right? Everybody knows I've been conflict avoidant. Do you all trust me that for the next 6 months, I try this out with the help of the team, right? And so that's where you get some of these actualization hierarchies happening.
Okay, now I promised that we would talk about the third characteristic of Teal Organizations, evolutionary purpose. And one of the things I wanted to draw out is that you talk about how this includes a fundamental shift from predict and control to sense and respond in terms of our putting our purpose into the 5-year plan. And I thought to myself, sense and respond in terms of navigating a business, an organization's direction. Of course, we have to do that, but don't we also need to engage in some prediction and hopefully try to control, even though we can't?
Yes, absolutely. Right. That's another of these misunderstanding is that we would go, from one extreme to the other extreme. Right now, we come from a perspective where we tend to try to predict and control everything because that makes us feel safe, right? And so you have all of these organizations that spend time doing the 5-year strategic plan, and then maybe their 2-year midterm planning, and then the yearly budgeting cycles, and that break it down into monthly objectives. And a lot of these organizations, people know that it makes no sense. Like you've made this yearly budget for the next year, in great detail that you've negotiated, and people try to underpromise so that they can over-deliver, and you have all of these games in these large organizations that are incredibly painful. Everybody knows that this is just a political budget, right? And 2 months in, the world has changed, right? Like COVID happened, or there was a war in Ukraine, or the dollar has crashed, or whatever it is, right? And yet people still cling on to that budget in ways that no longer make sense. So the question is not, do we need budgets, but what is really the reason budgets exist? And I've seen some organizations, the nature of their business needs them to plan ahead. I've seen other organizations, the nature of their business requires almost no budgeting, right? And so the question is, what's the minimum amount of planning that we need given the nature of a business? So if we need to secure raw material contracts, or we need to know what we sell in 12 months so that we, have the production capacity for it, then we need to plan. Otherwise, can we just sense and respond into what is needed? There's this metaphor that brought it home for me from Brian Robertson, a guy created a system called Holacracy. And he has this metaphor where he says, imagine we were to be on a bike in the way we run an organization, right? Before we would go on a bike, we would plan everything till the end point, right? And we would start by saying, okay, we start at this exact angle. And then after 2.5 seconds, we move this angle to this, and we map out the entire terrain until we arrive, right? And in order not to be distracted, maybe the best thing is to close our eyes while we're driving because we don't want to be distracted, right? We just want to execute our plan. And the reality of it, of course, something is going to happen that wasn't expected, right? There's going to be a pothole. There's going to be a car parked where, it shouldn't have been. And so we're going to stumble. We're going to fall from our bike. We might hurt ourselves. And then typically in business, we would go, okay, we know what the problem is. We didn't plan well enough. We should have planned even more with even more data, right? And let's fire the person who didn't plan well, and let's, re-engineer that process. And actually, the way we use that, we go on a bike is we have an idea of the route, but, we're constantly sensing with all of our senses, and we're constantly adjusting. And if we suddenly see that the road over there has less traffic, we change roads. If we see that the road there is actually much more beautiful than we ever imagined, we will change there, right? And so that is what sense and responding is compared to, predict and control. And so it's not abandoning all planning, but it's opening up the possibility to be guided and to sense and to respond to where the purpose calls us.
Now, of course, you wrote Reinventing Organizations originally 10 years ago, as I mentioned. It's the 10-year anniversary before the pandemic, when the word pivot became the word of businesses. How are you pivoting your business during the pandemic and then post-pandemic? And I think for a lot of people, they've found it extremely challenging to have to be changing roads, to use your bike metaphor, so often, so much of the time with their business, and also tremendously stressful on teams and staffs. We have to change. We need different skills than the skills we had. We didn't plan well in terms of people getting the training they needed because we didn't even know that's what we needed. And I'm curious if you can talk about that, if you see this sense of the speed of change accelerating for organizations when it comes to this sense and respond.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Like compared to 20 years ago when I, first dabbled in the world of business, I mean, the speed at which things are changing, there's this famous acronym in the business world of VUCA, there's more, volatility, uncertainty, and complexity and ambiguity. It's just exploded. And our traditional ways of dealing with it are really exhausted. Like our traditional fixed pyramid, fixed reporting lines where every change means a fundamental change of, job description, of role. It means I need to fire somebody, I need to rehire somebody, is exhausting and is painful on people, and, feels all of these things are like big change projects, right? And what you see is that these organizations that function in these more nimble ways, where we already work with these distributed roles, tend to find this easier. Not easy by any means. Change is difficult. It's difficult for all of us. But if I already don't have like this one box from which that needs now to be redesigned, from which I would be fired, but I have these 7 to 8 roles, and Tami, you have these 7 to 8 roles. Well, I'll probably keep 3 or 4. And now with COVID, suddenly I will take on 3 or 4 others. And this whole thing adjusts much more easily. And so I've really heard from organizations that had made this leap before that they found it much, much easier to deal with these changes because we didn't start from this sort of fixed position. But I think from a broader perspective, I think we lean into confusing, difficult times. We talked about this earlier. I look at it from a place of adventure, but these are times I think that if we don't have a lens of these are times that are confusing and difficult, and therefore they're extraordinary times for us to learn and to grow as individuals. If we don't hold that perspective, it's just painful. I think those of us who are lucky to hold a perspective to say, all of these, every time there's pain, every time there's confusion, wow, it's an invitation for me to learn something about myself, for places in which I am stuck, for places in which I've inherited beliefs that no longer serve me, for places where I've inherited things from my lineage, from my family that no longer serves me. And wow, this is an opportunity to put a spotlight on this and to free myself from some of these constraints. And wow, I've become, a more open person. I've become more free in the process. I think if we don't hold that perspective, then this is just an extraordinarily confusing and painful time.
Frederic, I'm going to take that clip out and play it again and again for myself when I need to be reminded and inspired. Thank you. And the question it brings up for me is, how can you help people make that shift to have that kind of attitude? So it's not just an inspiring thought, but an embodied sense.
Yeah.
What are the inner skills, if you will, or the inner orientation we need to have in your view?
I'm convinced that what is most helpful in these things is for us to have collective spaces where we grapple with this. Part of what is most painful about this is that we feel lonely with this, right? Right? Whatever change happens at work, COVID, etc., and I feel out of my depth. I feel challenged. I feel maybe I can't deal with this. I'm an imposter. I shouldn't be in the place I'm in. And then I feel terribly lonely. The truth is, everybody else is feeling pretty much the same thing, right? And so can we create spaces in the workplace where we collectively deal with this? And this requires good preparation. This requires good facilitation. Otherwise, this can become a terrible talking shop where everybody just, goes down depressed. But if we find good spaces where we facilitate as well, and we talk about our growing edges, and I get to examine, right, what is mine to learn in this situation? Where am I bumping up against my own shadows, my own inherited beliefs? And, Tami, you and I get to talk one-on-one, and you tell me, and suddenly, oh, I see the full humanity in you. And, you disclosing helps me go deeper and helps me disclose. And I come out of it with more appreciation for yourself and with more learning for myself, right? And then we go back into a small group of 8 where nobody needs to share, but some people want to share and they share what they've learned. And suddenly I come home from 1 hour, with this group of 8, and I have a spring in my step, and I feel like, I can take on, the next chapter that happens. And there are organizations who create these spaces in very deliberate ways, on a weekly, on a monthly basis for people to learn from each other and to acknowledge that, we all are in similar situations where we're all challenged and we all can grow. And rather than us being all, closed down individually and in fear and trying to project this image of, I have everything in control, I'm this professional, we actually get to share and learn and grow together.
Very helpful. I know that principle of the power of people gathering in small groups and sharing is part of what informed the creation of the Week, which is this project that you started 4 years ago with your wife, Helene. And, it's interesting, Frederic, of course, you could have built some kind of consulting and coaching and speaking empire around reinventing organizations and stayed in, you had so much traction with the book. You didn't do that. Instead, you made this big shift yourself. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So a bit more than 4 years ago now, my wife and I had, our own version of an awakening to the climate crisis, of to really understand what's at stake. We had friends visiting, and they had had the courage to really look what's happening. They had kids the same age as ours, and they stayed with us for a week. And when they left, I realized that obviously I knew about the climate crisis, but I realized that I was still in sort of a defensive mode. I was actually living in a sort of massive form of cognitive dissonance that I think a lot of us live in, which is, on one hand, I knew climate crisis is happening. I mean, look at all the wildfires that you were talking about. I know it's happening. I know it's pretty bad. On the other hand, there was a big part of me that just didn't want to know because it felt depressing and overwhelming. And I worry about my kids. And so I did my best to try to tune it out. Every time I would see an article come by, talking about climate, I would read the first few lines and I go like, "Oh, I'm not sure I want to deal with this because it feels overwhelming." And I think a lot of us are in this situation where we feel like I should know more, like I should read more about this, I should do something about this. And on the other hand, like engaging with this just feels overwhelming. And so I pretend it's not really happening. These friends helped us to snap out of it. And we said, like, hey, if they had the courage to find out what's happening, we can do it too. And so Ellen, my wife, and I really looked into it. And we went through what, we talk about as sort of like this U-shaped journey of, we went down, and there's a lot of fear and sadness and anger and shock that came up when we realized, like, what scientists are predicting. What will happen in my lifetime? What will happen in my kids' lifetime? Right? One day I calculated how old I will be and how old my kids will be in 2050, because I kept reading scientific articles. In 2050, right, pretty much everybody around the equator will have had to flee because it's going to become unlivable, like 200 million to 1 billion climate refugees in 2050. And 2050 felt abstract. And then I calculate in 2050, I will be in my early 70s. Hopefully I'll be, in great health and, grandkids and travel and, and retired, enjoying life. And my kids will be in their 30s. They might just be establishing themselves. Maybe they become parents. And suddenly I realized, like, this image I had of my early retirement, this is probably going to be time of violence, of, maybe famines, and it changed everything for me. And so, that's sort of, going down to you. And luckily, we begin to get stuck there. Like, nobody gets stuck there if you really look at it. You get stuck there if you stay superficial in climate anxiety. But if you really go there, you tend to come out of it on the other side.
Let me ask a question. Let me ask a question about that. What does that mean to really go there? What does that mean? Because I think a lot of us have sort of thought we've gone there and haven't come out the other side. So maybe we didn't really go there.
Yeah. For me, and Elaine, my wife, because it's very much something we did together, it was a decision. Let's read everything we can. Let's try to make it as tangible as we can about what's going to happen to us. So not, icebergs melting, but like, what's going to happen to us, what's going to happen to our kids, and never shy away, never like go, this is too much. And we were in a good enough place in our lives to do that. Like, and we took it almost sort of as a spiritual experience of saying, let's do this, and at the same time observe ourselves. What is happening? How are we reacting? What are the emotions that are coming up? And and then see how we can deal with it. And we're well supported by friends and family that if we go to a dark place, we will find the support. But if you really go, there's something visceral, I think, in us where life takes over and says, okay, if this is what's happening, this is the energy you'll have to do something about it. And what we experienced, millions of people have done it before. We're quite late to this, to this climate awakening, and there's millions of people that are mobilizing right now who came out of it on the other side of the U, full of clarity and energy of like, this is obviously something that will have a big priority in my life, because now that I've seen this, I cannot unsee it. And so when we came out of this, it was very clear to me that I was going to close the chapter on reinventing organization. My wife had just published a beautiful book about perinatal loss, and she closed that chapter, and we decided, okay, let's do our contribution and very quickly what that contribution would be was clear to us is let's help other people who live in this cognitive dissonance go through this you and emerge on the other side full of energy and clarity and willing to roll up their sleeves. And so we created an experience that in a relatively short amount of time leads groups of people. So it's not something you can do on your own. So the week is something that you do with a group of friends or family or colleagues or people in your church or in your sangha or whatever it is. And you meet 3 times over the course of a week. That's why we named this thing the week. You meet 3 times over the course of a week. Every time an hour and a half, you watch a 1-hour film that we've very lovingly scripted and produced. And then we set up a group conversation to make sense of it all and to digest the emotions that come up. And this experience leads you through that you. And even though the beginning is kind of hard, what we hear over and over again, by now there's 75,000 people who've registered and gone through it, is yes, the beginning is hard, but in many ways, what a relief to leave this cognitive dissonance. What a relief to have, okay, now I know, I can stop pushing these news away. Now I know, and now I can be on the other side and I can dedicate myself to doing something about it.
Now, you mentioned the you a couple of times, and just to make that clear for people, Otto Scharmer, of course, is known as the person who created Theory U, and he's actually one of the contributors to Sounds True's inner MBA program, and he talks about how you can bring Theory U, at least he provides the framework for how you could bring that into your organization. Tell me how you and Helene went through Theory U in your climate awareness awakening.
So, this might take us longer than we have here, but there's commonalities between the Otto Scharmer's you that I have a huge amount of respect for, and there's some differences. The you that we talk about is really sort of an emotional you, right? Of you go down, and often people experience their own version of, it might be anger or shock or dread or sadness when you realize where we're at and what is likely to happen if we don't turn this around, right? And then come out of it on the other side with energy and clarity and dedication to do something about this. So we very much talk about sort of an emotional you, but there's a lot of points of similarities with Otto Scharmer's you, which also ask you to go deep and not stay at the surface of problems, and which is very much what we also do in the second episode, where we go into deeper questions of how did we even get into this mess and how might we get out of it, and what are the change of perspectives that are needed, what are the change of narratives that are needed, what are the changes of stories that are needed. And that is very similar to what Otto has in his Theory U.
What was it like for you in your own experience at the bottom of the U, where you've gone through your emotional experience, but your new activism and choice of how you're going to engage, it hasn't emerged yet. It's still to come.
Yeah. It was difficult. It was difficult. It required for me trust that something would show up, right? It required trust that I wouldn't stay there, and that something would call me to do something with what I was learning. And again, we chose to start this in a moment where we're in a good enough place in our lives to engage with this. But for me, there was definitely an element of trust, and there was a little bit a little bit of pride involved, I must admit, of okay, you know what, I can go through this, and I'm not going to shy away. I'm not going to close the book, and I'm not going to go back to pretending this doesn't exist. I will stay in this until I come out on the other side. And for me, everybody's different, but for me, doing this with Len was immensely helpful, not doing this alone. And that's why we created the week as a group experience, because people in a short amount of time go through this as a group, and it makes all the difference in the world. So anybody who's going through whatever version of this, their own dark night of the soul. I mean, never stay alone in this. And there's so many people who've gone through this before who will understand where you're at and will love to hear from you and to help you because they've gone through it before and have lots of love and compassion to share. So the problem is always when we stay on our own. And it's so much easier when we have the courage to share where we're at.
I feel very inspired to do the week. I haven't done it yet, but people can learn more at week.000. Is that how you say it?
Yeah, the week.
Right. I'll say that again for the audio here. I haven't gone through the week, but I feel very inspired to do it. And people can learn more at week.000. And in looking at the website, I saw these four, I would call them design principles that went into your creation of the week, that we need social groups, we need each other. And I think you've made that very clear. And I can really feel that, Frederic, in your presentation of what we need, these holding spaces for our human process. We need places where we feel safe, point number 2, and where we can explore and shift our inner narratives. But then the final point, the fourth design principle, is the one that I wanted you to talk about, which is that joy, pride, and courage make for lasting mobilization more than fear or guilt. And I thought that is really true. And I wonder if you could say more about how you discovered that.
Yeah. The first time I became aware of it was when I started looking into the civil rights movement. Right. I was fascinated by the civil rights movement because the question for me is, how come we have this climate abyss and we don't have millions of people who are mobilized? Right. And then I looked at the civil rights movement, and these were incredibly brave people. I mean, the people who were in the streets knew that they would have attack dogs that might be unleashed on them, that they would be beaten, that they might die. I mean, and they were in the streets, right? Like nobody, for the climate, we're not asked to do anything nearly as brave, right? And so how did they manage at the time to get, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, the freedom riders. And when you look at it, I mean, the importance of singing in the civil rights movement has often been forgotten. But the importance of singing and the joy of being together and the joy of singing together was foundational, right? The sense of pride of like, we are courageous, we are at the forefront of this, we are in this historic moment, was foundational, right? And so that's just one example, right? If you look at the suffragettes, and if you look at most of these movements, if you look at in Serbia at Otpor, right, this movement that managed to topple a dictator over there. I mean, they used, people were mischievous, and there was humor, and there was, they were just more fun than the dictator, and there was, this sense of pride and courage. You could be arrested, you could be beaten up, but like you're smarter than them, right? And so, if you look at all these historic movements, they knew this profound truth, right? And then when you look at the environmental movement and the climate movement, it's really a movement that for now decades often has been associated with guilt and fear, right? Fear about what's going to happen with the planet, and guilt about, guilt and shame about how we've contributed to this. And guilt and shame are, can be good short-term motivator. There's some literature and social science about this, but they're not good motivators for long-term. Nobody stays in a movement because of guilt and fear. I mean, that's just not, but you stay in a movement if the movement brings you joy and energy and, is built around pride and courage. And so I think it's an important component. Some movements got that right, and Sunrise in the US and Extinction Rebellion at first got that right in the UK. And I think it's really something that, we need if we want people to join this. I mean, if I want to be able to look at my children in 10, 20, 30, I'm convinced that our children will look at us and will ask us, hey, daddy, mommy, what did you know? And what did you do? I'm convinced they will ask us this. And I want to look at them and be able to say, I had the courage to look. And then I joined this mobilization and we turned this around. And boy, these were the best years of my life, right? Boy, this was an adventure. This was fun. Right? I don't want to tell them like, I sort of looked at it. I sort of did some things that I feel bad about the things I didn't do. Right?
the week.000. 3 90-minute meetings with a small group of people. How many? How many does it take?
We say that the ideal group is 4 to 8. I mean, we've had a group of 1,000 people who do it, and then they watch it all together. It's something powerful. Like there's some in some organizations where you watch it with 100 colleagues or 200 colleagues, and it's powerful to know that everybody has seen the same thing. Like everybody talks about it at the water cooler. But then for the conversation part, you break into groups of 4 to 8 because that's sort of the ideal group for everybody to really be, have time to speak and be heard. So 4 to 8 is ideal, and if you're more, you simply break it into subgroups.
It's amazing to me that after 3 meetings like that over the course of a week, that you've seen real powerful change happen. That's a very small time commitment for such a big possible mobilization.
Yeah, I mean, we're ourselves a little stunned. So we have quite a solid measurement and evaluation strategy in place, as these things are called. So where we survey people right after and 3 months later and 6 months later, simply to see how did that experience stay with you, and people just report that there's profound inner shift but also social shift. Like suddenly it becomes possible to talk with your friends and family and colleagues in different ways. There's a concept that people talk about called pluralistic ignorance, which is that when it comes to climate, a lot of people are concerned but feel that other people aren't concerned because they don't talk about it, right? And so a lot of people are concerned, but think they're the only ones, and so nobody talks about it. And then the week allows this process where suddenly, say with colleagues at the workplace, you suddenly realize, wow, Tami, you're concerned about this too, and you're already doing some things, and then like this other colleague. And so suddenly we realize we're not alone in this, and it's shift the social norm where after we've seen this, we can now talk about this, right? And next time in the workplace, for example, there's an opportunity to do something like, hey, let's revisit our packaging, like let's revisit our supply chain, like let's design our product differently, like let's not fly everybody into this place, but can we do it because suddenly the social norm has shifted. We've had this experience in common.
Frederic Laloux, what an inspired and inspiring human you are. Thank you so much. Thanks for bringing your spirit of adventure and creativity and solution-oriented heart to the world. And thanks for being here. I know you're very particular about how you spend your time and very intentional. And I'm so glad that you chose to be here on Insights at the Edge, celebrating the 10-year anniversary of Reinventing Organizations and inviting people to come join at the week.000. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tami. This was a delight. Thank you.
Sounds true. Waking up the world. And my Sounds True 1 friends, we are going to come back in, let's take 5 good minutes here. So a quarter after the hour, according to, that would be, quarter after the hour, we'll come back and we have a chance to throw some of your questions, lob them gently at Frederic at a quarter after the hour.